when a young boy suddenly interrupted the judge in a tense courtroom, accusing his foster parents of terrible abuse. The judge at first considered the possibility of exaggeration. But a single detail in the boy's trembling voice shifted everything in that moment, throwing the entire room into an uproar and sparking a desperate battle to protect him from the very people who should have been caring for him. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from. If you believe in the power of courage, give this video a like and subscribe for more. The day Timothy arrived at Smithfield Middle School, he carried himself as though he expected to be punished at any moment. He was only 11, a small boy with brown hair that curled over his forehead, big eyes that darted nervously around him, and a gentle voice that spoke volumes even when he barely used it. It was late autumn, and the leaves around the school yard had begun their fiery transformation into shades of orange and red. The morning was crisp, and the halls echoed with the chatter of students reuniting with friends after the weekend. But Timothy, clutching his backpack straps so tightly his knuckles turned white, slipped unnoticed through the crowd until he reached the front office. "Hello, can I help you?" asked the school secretary, a kind woman in her 50s whose nameplate read Ms. Morgan. She offered Timothy a warm smile. She was accustomed to new students, but there was something about the boy's timid stance that made her heart clench. "My name is Timothy," he whispered, eyes fixed on his shoes. I'm supposed to start here today." He produced a crumpled slip of paper from his pocket, which Ms. Morgan took and read. It was the official notice from Child Protective Services indicating a new placement. That alone was enough for Ms. Morgan to realize Timothy was a foster child, but she had no idea of his deeper wounds or the life he had endured before arriving in her office. "I'll walk you to your homeroom," she offered, stepping out from behind the desk and motioning for him to follow. Timothy obeyed without a word. As they walked, Ms. Morgan pointed out the cafeteria, the lockers, and the library that smelled of old books and fresh possibilities. Timothy's eyes flicked toward each place but never lingered. He seemed uneasy, constantly looking over his shoulder as if expecting someone to appear and reprimand him. Ms. Morgan felt a small tug of concern. "You'll like Mr. Jones," she said lightly, hoping to encourage him. "He's a great teacher. He coaches basketball after school and—" A loud slam of a locker down the hall made Timothy flinch, and his eyes, wide with panic, darted to the source of the noise. It was just another student running late, but Timothy's reaction revealed more about him than words ever could. Ms. Morgan paused and knelt slightly to meet his gaze. "It's okay," she said gently. "This is a safe place. If you ever feel scared or upset, you can always come to me, or to any of your teachers, all right?" Timothy blinked a few times, unsure of how to respond. Eventually, he nodded. He followed her to Mr. Jones's classroom, where they found the teacher, tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a friendly smile, writing tomorrow's homework assignment on the board. Mr. Jones turned around as they entered, his face lighting up with a welcoming expression. "Good morning," he greeted. "You must be Timothy." Timothy nodded, hugging his backpack straps again. He noticed the cluster of desks, the motivational posters on the walls, the aquarium with 2 little goldfish near the windowsill, and the bright sunlight illuminating the dust motes in the air. It was ordinary, but for some reason, it felt like the safest room he had been in for a long time. "Make yourself comfortable," Mr. Jones said, guiding Timothy to an empty desk in the second row. "We're just getting started with morning announcements, so you haven't missed much. If you have any questions, just let me know." Timothy gave a quiet thank you, and sank into his seat. He felt out of place, as though everyone else knew how to be happy and safe except him. The day wore on with typical middle school routines. English class, math problems, lunch break in a noisy cafeteria, yet Timothy's anxiety never seemed to subside. He kept quiet, always watching, always on guard. Ms. Jackson, who taught language arts, noticed that Timothy barely looked at her during reading exercises, choosing instead to stare out the window or keep his gaze locked on his tattered notebook. She tried gently to draw him out of his shell, asking him questions about his interests. "Do you like to write stories? Any favorite books?" she asked, her tone delicate as if speaking to a wounded bird. But Timothy just shrugged and wrote something in the margins of his notebook that she couldn't decipher. During lunch, Mr. Parker, the school janitor, was mopping the corridor floors when he saw Timothy eating alone on a bench near the lockers. Mr. Parker was an older man with gray hair, a slight limp from an old injury, and an empathetic demeanor that made most students trust him. He walked by, pushing his mop bucket, and offered Timothy a friendly nod. "Hey there," he said. "New here, right? How's your first day going?" Timothy swallowed the lump in his throat. He noticed how kind Mr. Parker's eyes were. "It's fine," he answered softly, though his expression suggested anything but fine. Mr. Parker wasn't one to pry. Instead, he gave a gentle shrug. "If you ever need anything, don't be afraid to ask. I've been around this place a long time, and I know it can be tough being the new kid." Timothy nodded. He didn't dare meet Mr. Parker's gaze for longer than a fleeting second. When the janitor moved on, Timothy glanced around at the other kids in the hallway. Most of them were shouting, laughing, or hanging out in groups. He felt invisible, but invisibility was comforting compared to the fear of being noticed in the wrong way. He knew all too well what could happen when he drew attention, and the memories were still raw in his mind. When the final bell rang that afternoon, Timothy slung his backpack over his shoulder, heading to the front entrance. The sky outside had clouded over, and a light drizzle pattered on the sidewalk. He saw other kids running to their parents' cars, piling into buses, or chatting with friends. He walked alone, scanning the pickup lane for the black car he was told would come for him. It arrived a bit late, headlights piercing the growing dusk, and Timothy recognized it as belonging to Mike and Laura Peters, his current foster parents. Mike Peters lowered the passenger side window and gestured impatiently. "Get in, Tim," he called. His voice sounded controlled, but Timothy knew that anger often simmered beneath that surface. It was an anger he had learned to fear. The boy hopped into the back seat, careful not to make any sudden move. Laura Peters, sitting in the front passenger seat, twisted around with a stiff smile. "How was your day?" she asked, but she did so in a tone that suggested she expected a specific answer. Timothy cleared his throat. "It was okay," he whispered, eyes darting to Mike, then back to his lap. "Just okay?" Mike repeated, pulling the car out of the school parking lot. His knuckles tightened around the steering wheel. "We want you to do better than okay, Timothy. We expect you to work hard, make friends, behave." Timothy nodded quickly, sinking into the seat. He desperately wanted to avoid any conflict. As the car cruised through the rain-slicked streets, he stared out the window, counting the raindrops and ignoring the dread coiling in his stomach. The drive was quiet until they reached the Peters home, a neat two-story house in a suburban neighborhood that tried its best to exude normalcy. But behind the carefully trimmed lawn and white picket fence, the air felt heavy with tension. The moment Timothy stepped into the foyer, Laura closed the door behind them and locked it with what seemed like an unnecessary force. She spun around, glaring at him. "Don't embarrass us," she said through clenched teeth, barely above a whisper. "We have rules, and you need to follow them." "Understood." Timothy nodded, keeping his eyes lowered. He remembered the last time he had made too much noise by accidentally dropping a dish. That memory, the explosion of anger, the subsequent bruise, still haunted him. He swallowed the lump in his throat and forced out a barely audible "Yes, ma'am." Mike set his keys on the side table and looked Timothy up and down. "Go to your room, finish your homework, and come down for dinner when Laura calls," he said. "If I check and you're not making progress on that schoolwork, we're going to have a problem." Timothy murmured his agreement and hurried up the stairs. His room was small, with a single bed and a desk that faced the window. Rain drummed on the roof, a steady, sorrowful rhythm that accompanied the churning in his stomach. He set his backpack on the floor, sank into the chair at his desk, and stared at the blank homework sheet. He listened to Laura and Mike's muffled voices downstairs. Sometimes they argued, sometimes they whispered conspiratorially, but Timothy had learned it was safer not to eavesdrop. He picked up a pencil and tried to concentrate on the homework, yet his mind kept wandering back to the quiet hallways of Smithfield Middle School. He remembered Ms. Jackson's gentle attempt to engage him in conversation, Mr. Jones's reassuring presence, and even the brief warmth of Mr. Parker's greeting. A small part of him wished he could live at school, where eyes might watch him, but not with hostility. He wondered if that might protect him from the trouble brewing just below the surface of the Peters household. That night, dinner was a silent affair. The only sounds were forks scraping plates and the occasional polite question, "Did you finish your spelling assignment?" answered with a one-word response. Afterward, Timothy helped wash dishes, carefully avoiding any slip that might earn him a hissed reprimand or worse. When he headed to bed, every footstep up the stairs felt like treading on eggshells. At school the next day, he arrived earlier than necessary, seeking solace in the still empty halls. He found Mr. Parker setting up cleaning supplies. The janitor smiled. "You're here bright and early," Mr. Parker said. "Couldn't sleep?" Timothy shook his head, trying to offer a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I just wanted to get here," he said softly. "I feel safer at school." Mr. Parker tilted his head, noticing how Timothy's left arm was held a bit too stiffly against his body. He wanted to ask, but something in the boy's guarded demeanor told him that Timothy wasn't ready to talk. Instead, the janitor patted the mop handle lightly. "Well, if you ever need someone to talk to, or a place to wait before class, you can hang around here. Just make sure you don't slip on the wet floors." Timothy nodded. "Thank you," he whispered. As the weeks passed, Timothy's teachers began to notice subtle things. Fresh bruises hidden under long sleeves, how Timothy would flinch whenever someone gestured too quickly. He rarely spoke unless called on, and even then, his voice trembled. Mr. Jones found him lingering in the classroom during breaks, as though afraid to venture into the chaos of the hallways. Ms. Jackson observed how he never raised his hand to ask for help, even when he was obviously struggling with an assignment. One afternoon, Ms. Jackson decided to gently confront Timothy when she saw him alone in the library. She sat across from him at a table lined with books about historical civilizations. "Timothy," she said softly, "how are you feeling today?" He looked up, startled. For a moment, he almost seemed ready to confide in her, but then his gaze fell to his lap. He thought of Mike's warnings. What would they do to him if he told anyone about the bruises or the name-calling or the way Laura would punish him for the smallest mistakes? "I'm okay," he replied, barely audible. Ms. Jackson didn't push him. She just nodded. "If you ever want to talk, I'm here," she said. "Sometimes it helps to share. And I notice you've been upset lately. We don't want you to go through this alone." Timothy swallowed. There was a lump in his throat he couldn't seem to dislodge. "Thank you," he managed. I'm not ready." She reached out and gave his hand a gentle pat. "That's all right," she said. "We can wait." But waiting became painful for everyone concerned, especially for Mr. Jones. He had grown quite fond of Timothy's quiet diligence and saw real potential in his academic work. He was also the type of teacher who believed in forging genuine connections with his students, and it killed him to see Timothy flinch or withdraw into himself more each day. Finally, after noticing yet another bruise, he decided to speak to Ms. Jackson about it. They met after classes in the staff lounge. "I've got a really bad feeling," Mr. Jones said, arms folded across his chest. "Timothy showed up with another bruise today, on his wrist this time. He told me he banged it on a desk, but that's the third bruise I've seen in 2 weeks. And each time, he has a new explanation." Ms. Jackson sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I know. And I've tried to get him to open up, but he's terrified of something, or someone. If we suspect abuse at home, we have a responsibility to report it." "I already told the principal," Mr. Jones replied, "but we need more than suspicion. The principal said we should keep our eyes open, document everything, and see if the school counselor can get him to talk. But if Timothy won't talk, what do we do? Ms. Jackson's eyes softened with concern. We keep trying. The system can be slow, but we can't give up on him. That very evening, Timothy stayed unusually late, drifting through the halls as if he had nowhere else to go. Mr. Parker found him in the corridor, just outside the gym. The janitor put a hand on Timothy's shoulder. "School's over, kiddo," he said gently. "You should head on home." Timothy swallowed hard, tears brimming in his eyes. "Mr. Parker," he whispered, voice trembling, "can I stay here? Just for tonight? I promise I won't cause trouble. I'm afraid to go home." The janitor's heart clenched at that confession. He didn't want to scare the boy by demanding answers, but alarm bells were ringing in his head. He knelt down to meet Timothy's eye level. "Why are you scared?" Mr. Parker asked softly. Timothy's lip quivered. He couldn't bring himself to say it aloud, but his eyes pleaded for help. "Please," he managed. "I just need somewhere to stay." Mr. Parker gently shook his head, though it hurt him to do it. "I can't let you stay in the school overnight. If something happened to you here, or if the alarms went off—" He paused, wanting to say the right thing. "But maybe we should go talk to someone who can help. Mr. Jones is still around, I think. Or Ms. Dawson, the social worker, might be able to do something." At the mention of Ms. Dawson, Timothy went pale. He knew that if Ms. Dawson got involved, everything might unravel, and the Peters would inevitably find out. The fear of what they might do if they learned he'd confessed was overwhelming. He pulled back, shaking his head. "They'll make it worse," he whispered. "Who will?" Mr. Parker asked, though deep down, he had a suspicion. Timothy just stared at the floor, silent tears slipping down his cheeks. Finally, Mr. Parker had to make a choice. He couldn't leave the boy to wander the school, and he also couldn't send him home without at least telling someone. He stood, placing a comforting hand on Timothy's shoulder. "All right," he said softly, "let's do this the right way. I'm going to get Ms. Dawson on the phone. Just promise me you'll stay right here. We'll figure this out together." Timothy trembled. He nodded slowly, though he seemed more terrified than ever. When Ms. Dawson arrived, the social worker found Timothy hunched on a bench in the main entrance, knees drawn up to his chest. She approached with a gentle smile, kneeling beside him. "Timothy, my name is Ms. Dawson," she said quietly. "I'm here to help. Would you like to talk somewhere private?" Timothy eyed her warily. She was dressed in a neatly pressed blouse and slacks, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. She had soft eyes and a warm, patient manner. But he didn't know if he could trust her. Still, Mr. Parker stood nearby, nodding encouragingly, so Timothy gave in. He followed Ms. Dawson to an empty conference room. She closed the door gently behind them, pulling up 2 chairs near a table. She took a deep breath before speaking. "Timothy," Ms. Dawson began, "I understand you might be scared. But I need to know why you feel you can't go home." Timothy looked at his hands, twisting his fingers until his knuckles turned white. After a painfully long silence, he muttered, "It's not safe." Ms. Dawson nodded, keeping her voice calm and steady. "Not safe because of who?" His eyes flicked up, tears clinging to his lashes, but he quickly averted his gaze again. "The Peters," he managed. "They get mad at me for everything. It's my fault, but it hurts. They—" His voice caught in his throat. Ms. Dawson's heart broke at the sight. She had dealt with too many children in similar situations, and it never got any easier. "Timothy, listen to me," she said, trying to maintain gentle eye contact. "This is not your fault. If someone is hurting you, that's on them, not you. You did nothing to deserve it. I promise I'll do whatever I can to keep you safe." She reached out tentatively, and he let her rest a hand on his shoulder for a brief moment. "I know," he said, voice shaky, "but if you tell them, they'll come after me." Ms. Dawson squeezed her eyes shut for a second, steeling herself. "We're going to do this carefully," she said. "We have procedures. We'll investigate, okay? We won't just send you back without making sure." Timothy nodded, sniffing. He wasn't entirely convinced, but he couldn't hold back anymore. Ms. Dawson asked him for details, but he clammed up again, fear gripping his chest. All he would say was that he couldn't go home tonight because something bad might happen. Ms. Dawson, sensing his terror, decided that was enough for the moment. She called Child Protective Services and arranged for an immediate check. Timothy was given a place to stay that night under emergency supervision. The next day, Ms. Dawson, along with another CPS worker, visited the Peters home. Mike and Laura Peters greeted them politely at the door, surprise etched on their faces. They offered stiff smiles and cups of coffee, leading Ms. Dawson into a pristine living room decorated with family photos, none of which featured Timothy. Laura perched on the edge of an armchair, her posture perfect, while Mike stood near the fireplace, trying to appear relaxed but failing to hide his tense eyes. "Timothy's teacher told us he seemed troubled," Ms. Dawson said, purposely leaving out the part about his attempt to stay overnight at the school. "We just want to be sure everything is okay at home." Laura let out an airy laugh. "Timothy has always been a bit dramatic," she said, lifting a delicate teacup to her lip. "He's had quite a history before coming to us. We do what we can, but you know foster kids can carry a lot of baggage. Isn't that right, Mike?" Mike forced a sympathetic nod. "Yes, poor kid. We're trying to help him. He just has these episodes. He makes up stories sometimes. We've tried therapy, but he's resistant." Ms. Dawson studied their body language, the tightness in their smiles, the guarded way Laura placed her hand over Mike's. She posed a few more questions, each one answered politely but with a hint of condescension toward Timothy. Something in Ms. Dawson's gut told her these people were far from the doting foster parents they portrayed themselves to be. Yet there was no visible sign of violence, no broken furniture, no suspicious items left around, and no overt slip of the tongue. When Ms. Dawson left the Peters house that afternoon, she sat in her car, clutching the steering wheel. She couldn't shake the feeling that Timothy's situation was far more dire than a typical teenage outburst or attention-seeking behavior. She had encountered manipulative foster parents before, individuals who knew exactly how to appear cooperative and kind while hiding something sinister. Timothy's terror wasn't imaginary, she was sure of that. But proving it would require more concrete evidence. At Smithfield Middle School, Timothy returned after 2 days of staying in temporary care. He looked even more withdrawn than before, dreading the potential consequences of Ms. Dawson's visit to the Peters. By law, Ms. Dawson couldn't bar him from returning to them without stronger evidence, and for now, it seemed the arrangement would remain in limbo. The tension in Timothy's eyes grew daily, and his teachers noticed new bruises. One afternoon, Ms. Dawson arranged a private meeting with Timothy in a counseling room. She tried to ask him gently about what happened after she left the Peters house. Timothy's hands shook as he spoke. "They were angry," he said, voice quavering. "They wanted to know what I told you. I said nothing, but they didn't believe me." He swallowed, glancing down at the fresh bruise on his forearm, hidden under his long sleeves. I don't know what to do." Ms. Dawson's chest tightened with empathy and frustration. "This isn't your fault," she repeated, more firmly. "I'm going to do everything I can to make this right. But I need you to tell me what exactly happened, Timothy. If you can give us details, we can keep you out of that home." He closed his eyes, tears slipping down his cheeks. "They pushed me," he finally said. "They said I was lying to the social worker. They said if I don't stop, They threatened me." Though it wasn't a full confession of every abusive moment, it was enough for Ms. Dawson to push for a more urgent intervention. She documented everything, from Timothy's bruises to his account of the recent threats. With the support of Mr. Jones and Ms. Jackson, she forwarded these reports to Child Protective Services. That very week, a hearing was scheduled to determine if Timothy could remain with the Peters or if an alternative arrangement was necessary for his safety. In a small, stuffy courtroom, a judge listened to Ms. Dawson's testimony. The Peters lawyer argued that Timothy was fabricating stories due to emotional instability. However, the judge took the matter seriously enough to place Timothy temporarily in a youth shelter, away from the Peters, until a more thorough investigation could be completed. Timothy was both relieved and frightened by this outcome. He no longer had to go back to that house, but he also had no permanent place to belong. The youth shelter was a crowded facility with strict rules and shared dormitory-style rooms. Timothy lay awake at night, listening to the sounds of other children crying, talking, or shuffling around in their bunk. The gloom of uncertainty weighed heavily on him. He worried that the Peters would come for him, or that the system would just toss him back into a new, unpredictable environment. Memories of everything he had endured, being yanked by the arm, enduring harsh words, choking back tears, swirled in his mind. After 3 days, he slipped out of the shelter, his heart pounding with panic at the thought of being lost in the foster system forever. He had no plan, no money, and only the clothes on his back. The city streets were an alien world, but he preferred that to returning to abuse. He spent 2 nights sleeping behind dumpsters, scrounging for food in fast food trash bins, his body aching and his spirit more frightened than ever. On the 3rd night, as he huddled under an awning near a closed convenience store, he heard a familiar voice call out, "Timothy? Is that you?" Startled, he looked up to see Mr. Jones, who had stepped out of his car, eyes wide with shock and concern. Mr. Jones had been driving around the area after a tip from one of the shelter's staff that Timothy was missing. He recognized Timothy's silhouette curled up against the wall. Timothy tried to stand, but exhaustion and hunger made him dizzy. He stumbled, and Mr. Jones rushed over to support him. "Let's get you somewhere safe," Mr. Jones said, voice filled with relief and worry. "Come on. We'll figure this out." Timothy hesitated, but he was too tired to protest. I didn't know where else to go," he said quietly, tears forming in his eyes. "I was so scared." "It's all right," she said gently, though her face showed her anxiety. "We'll keep trying. Maybe we need more time." Time, however, was running out. The next week, the judge would announce a decision on whether Timothy should be returned to the Peters' custody. Mr. Jones could barely sleep. Ms. Dawson filed last-minute motions, requesting more interviews, more psychological evaluations, anything to buy a little more time. But it seemed the legal tide was turning in the Peters' favor. On the night before the final hearing, Timothy lay awake in his bed at Mr. Jones's house, staring at the ceiling. Memories flooded his mind. The stinging slaps, the hateful glares, the forced apologies, the constant fear. He remembered how the Peters would punish him for crying too loudly, or for doing poorly on a test, or for nothing at all. Then he recalled the gentle smiles of Ms. Jackson, Mr. Parker, Ms. Dawson, and especially Mr. Jones's unwavering kindness. He sat up, tears hot on his cheeks. He realized he had a choice. Remain silent and risk being dragged back into that nightmare, or speak up, no matter how scary, and possibly free himself forever. A shaky breath escaped him, and he clenched his fists. "I have to do it," he whispered to the dark. "I have to." The next morning, the final hearing took place in a larger courtroom than usual, with a few concerned teachers attending quietly. Timothy tried to ignore the Peters' contemptuous glare. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Ms. Dawson spoke passionately about Timothy's well-being, but the Peters' lawyer countered with polished arguments. Then the judge turned to Timothy, who stood at a small podium, trembling. "Timothy," the judge asked, voice measured, "is there anything you want to tell the court?" A hush fell over the room. Timothy's gaze flicked to Mr. Jones, who nodded encouragingly, tears shining in his eyes. Timothy took a shaky breath, heart pounding. He closed his eyes, recalling every painful memory, summoning every ounce of courage he had. When he finally opened his eyes again, he looked directly at Mike and Laura Peters. His voice came out soft but steady enough to be heard by everyone. "They hurt me," he said, each word laced with pain and resolution. "They threatened me. They hit me. They locked me in my room and told me it was my fault. I was always scared." His voice broke, tears streaming down his cheeks. "I'm scared now, but I have to say it. They hurt me." A stunned silence gripped the courtroom. Ms. Dawson let out a relieved breath, and Mr. Jones quietly wiped his own tears. The judge leaned forward, eyes compassionate but solemn. "Timothy," the judge said, "thank you for being brave and telling us this. Can you tell us more about what they did?" And Timothy did. His words poured out in a halting, emotional confession, about bruises, about nights spent cowering in fear, about the times he had tried to run away. Every detail hung in the air, raw and heartbreaking. Laura looked aghast, but her feigned shock wavered as the truth spilled out, while Mike glared furiously, his mask of composure cracking. The Peters lawyer tried to interject with objections, but the judge silenced him. "Let him speak," the judge ordered. By the time Timothy finished, his face was wet with tears, and his entire body shook. The judge's expression hardened. With a new clarity about the situation, the judge ordered that the Peters be investigated for child abuse charges, and Timothy remain under the care of Mr. Jones until further notice. The official verdict would come soon, but it was evident the Peters had lost whatever credibility they once had. In the ensuing days, formal charges were filed against Mike and Laura. The court found them guilty of multiple counts of abuse. The press of relief that Timothy felt was indescribable, yet fear still lingered in the back of his mind. He stayed with Mr. Jones, who tried to reassure him every time a car passed by the house at night. "They can't hurt you anymore," Mr. Jones would say, but the unease wouldn't vanish. 2.5 weeks went by without incident. Timothy began to believe life might settle into normalcy. Then, on a quiet Wednesday night, sometime after midnight, the front door of Mr. Jones's home was forced open. Timothy woke to the sound of splintering wood. Before he could fully comprehend what was happening, Mike and Laura Peters burst into his room, their faces twisted with rage and desperation. "Get up!" Mike hissed, grabbing Timothy by the arm. Laura stood by the doorway, a wild look in her eyes. "You ruined our lives," she spat. "You thought you could just get away with that?" Her voice shook with venom. Timothy tried to scream, but Mike clamped a hand over his mouth. Mr. Jones, awakened by the commotion, came rushing in from the hallway, only to be shoved aside by Laura. He stumbled, falling against the dresser. "Let him go," Mr. Jones roared, but Mike was already dragging Timothy through the door. Laura brandished a small revolver, her hand trembling. "Stay back," she warned Mr. Jones, her eyes flicking between him and Timothy. "He's coming with us, and if you follow, you'll regret it." Everything happened in a blur. Timothy was hauled into a van parked outside. Laura jumped into the passenger seat, gun still in hand, while Mike sped away into the night. Mr. Jones, reeling from a blow to the ribs, staggered to his feet and dialed 911. His heart hammered with fear, adrenaline surging through his veins. He prayed he wasn't too late. The next 4 days were a horrifying ordeal for Timothy. They traveled across state lines, stopping only briefly at deserted motels or empty back road. Mike and Laura made him hide in the back of the van, threatening him if he so much as peeked out the window. He had no idea where they were taking him, and every moment felt like a nightmare come to life. They ranted at him for destroying their reputation and demanded to know if he had told anyone else about their abuse. The abuse he suffered in those 4 days was mostly psychological. They seldom let him speak, and he was given minimal food and water. Laura loomed with that gun, and Mike's fury was palpable. Meanwhile, the FBI had joined the search, alerted by the police when it was clear Timothy's kidnappers had crossed state lines. Mr. Jones provided every detail he knew: the type of vehicle, the partial plate number, the approximate direction they had gone. Ms. Dawson also offered all the case files, hoping the information could help track them down. Time felt agonizingly slow, and each passing hour without Timothy's rescue tore at Mr. Jones's heart. On the fourth day, the FBI managed to track the van to a ramshackle property on the outskirts of a small rural town. Agents surrounded the place in the early morning light, weapons drawn, ready to negotiate or move in. A tense standoff began, with Mike shouting obscenities from a broken window, clutching Timothy as a shield. Laura, still limping from a scratch she had sustained earlier, brandished the gun with shaking hands. "Let the boy go," an FBI negotiator shouted through a megaphone. "This doesn't need to end in violence." Laura's gaze darted around frantically. "He ruined everything," she screamed. "He's the reason we lost everything. He destroyed us." Mike's grip on Timothy tightened, fingers digging into the boy's shoulder. Timothy was trembling, his face pale. He risked a glance at the forest of armed agents outside, praying they could save him. The FBI negotiator continued trying to talk them down, but Laura seemed beyond reason, consumed by her hatred and desperation. Then it happened in a flash. Laura raised the revolver, pointing it at Timothy, as though making a final, desperate threat to force the agents to back off. An FBI sniper, hidden behind a distant tree, took a shot at her leg to incapacitate her. She let out a pained scream, dropping the gun as she collapsed. In the same instant, an agent close to the house burst in, catching Mike by surprise. Mike reeled back, swinging wildly, but the agent struck him in the face with the butt of a rifle, knocking him out cold. Timothy was wrenched free from his grasp and pulled to safety. Everything seemed to speed up and slow down at the same time for Timothy. He found himself wrapped in a blanket, paramedics checking him over, flashing lights painting the early morning sky red and blue. He had bruises on his arms, dehydration, and an expression of dazed shock. Mike and Laura were apprehended on the spot, loaded into separate ambulances. They were immediately booked on charges of kidnapping and child endangerment, adding to their existing abuse charges. Their reign of terror over Timothy's life had come to a violent and definitive end. When Timothy was finally reunited with Mr. Jones, who had traveled there as soon as he got word of the standoff, he collapsed into the man's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Mr. Jones held him tight, whispering, "You're safe now. It's over. It's really over." Timothy's body shook with relief and lingering fear, but slowly, a fragile sense of security washed over him. He had survived against all odds. In the weeks that followed, Timothy returned to Mr. Jones's home, battling nightmares and flinching at sudden noises. Therapy sessions became a regular part of his routine. He attended them twice a week, talking through his traumas with a gentle, understanding counselor named Dr. Moreno. She helped him work through the guilt, the terror, and the deeply ingrained belief that he somehow deserved what happened to him. At Smithfield Middle School, Ms. Jackson and Mr. Parker welcomed him back with relief and cautious hugs, mindful of his tender state. Ms. Jackson introduced him to Ella, a kind classmate who took it upon herself to be Timothy's friend and confidant. Ella invited him to sit with her at lunch, helped him catch up on Miss schoolwork, and listened whenever he wanted to talk about simpler things, homework, jokes, or stories about the pets she once had. That budding friendship became a bright spot in his otherwise tumultuous life. Meanwhile, the legal system moved forward. Mike and Laura Peters faced a barrage of charges. Their kidnapping stunt left no doubt about their guilt. They received lengthy sentences, ensuring they would remain in prison for the foreseeable future. The day Timothy heard that they would not be able to come near him ever again was the day he finally slept without nightmares. Mr. Jones continued to be Timothy's rock. They settled into a comfortable day-to-day life. Early morning breakfasts, drives to school, discussions about Timothy's future. Seeing Timothy's improvements, his small smiles, his ability to laugh on rare occasions, filled Mr. Jones with a profound sense of purpose. And Timothy, for the first time in his life, began to entertain the hope that maybe, just maybe, he could truly belong to a family. By early spring, Mr. Jones began the formal adoption process. Timothy would still see Ms. Dawson for check-ins, but she was thrilled by how well Timothy was doing under Mr. Jones's care. Over the months, Timothy's bruises faded, though the emotional scars remained. In therapy, he learned to trust again, step by cautious step. And in Mr. Jones, he found unwavering support, a genuine father figure who would do anything to protect him. The adoption ceremony took place in a small, wood-paneled courtroom, far less imposing than the one where Timothy had first found the courage to speak out. This time, the judge wore a warm smile as Mr. Jones and Timothy stood side by side. Several staff members from Smithfield Middle School attended, including Ms. Jackson and Mr. Parker, and Ms. Dawson arrived with tears in her eyes. Ella and her family even showed up, bearing a bouquet of flowers. The judge cleared his throat. "Timothy," he said, "are you happy to have Mr. Jones as your legal parent?" Timothy nodded, glancing up at Mr. Jones with a watery smile. "Yes," he said quietly. He's everything I need." A solemn hush fell over the room as the judge signed the final papers. "Then it's my honor to declare that the adoption is official," the judge said. "Congratulations." Applause broke out, and Ms. Jackson dabbed at her eyes. Mr. Parker offered a grin, clapping enthusiastically. Ms. Dawson gave Timothy a heartfelt hug. He squeezed her tight, knowing he owed her so much. Ella bounced on her toes, her grin stretching from ear to ear. But the happiest sight was Timothy, leaning into Mr. Jones, tears of relief in his eyes as he felt, for the very first time, the fullness of love and stability. In the following weeks, life began to settle in ways Timothy had never known. He woke up each morning to a home that felt truly his. He attended school with Ella, sometimes meeting Mr. Parker in the halls for a quick chat, always seeing Ms. Jackson's encouraging smiles in class. The shadows of the Peters abuse still haunted him, appearing in nightmares or sudden flashbacks when someone made a rapid movement. But he had therapy sessions twice a week and an entire support network to remind him he was no longer alone. He began to participate in extracurricular activities. He joined the school's art club, surprising himself with how much he enjoyed painting. He still kept a low profile, not one for big crowds, but he found moments of genuine joy. Slowly, he learned to trust that not every adult was waiting to harm him, that not every loud sound was a harbinger of violence. There were nights he stayed up late, plagued by worry that something would come along and ruin his newfound peace, but each morning brought a little more assurance that he was safe. On a warm summer afternoon, Timothy and Mr. Jones took a trip to the local park. The sun glinted off the lake in the center, where families fed bread crumbs to the duck. Timothy felt the soft breeze on his face and took in the sound of distant laughter. "This place is really nice," he said, attempting a small smile. Mr. Jones nodded. "I thought you might like it," he replied. "There's a tree over there I used to sit under when I was younger, just to think about life." Timothy glanced at the towering oak tree, imagining a younger Mr. Jones. He took a deep breath, letting the warm, fresh air fill his lungs. He felt a stab of sadness, remembering all the times he had tried to hide bruises or emotional wounds, never imagining he would have the freedom to enjoy a day like this. But he also felt gratitude. For once, the gratitude overshadowed the fear. They walked along the winding path, Mr. Jones occasionally ruffling Timothy's hair. "You've come a long way," Mr. Jones said softly. "I know it's still hard, but I'm proud of you. Every day." Timothy swallowed around a lump in his throat, his emotions swirling. "Thank you," he whispered, looking up at the man who had stepped into his life and changed it so drastically. "For everything." In the months that followed, Timothy continued therapy, continued bonding with Mr. Jones, and gradually embraced his new normal. He discovered small pleasures, morning jogs around the neighborhood, baking attempts on rainy afternoons, or simply reading a book on the sofa, free from the anxiety of impending punishment. He still had moments of anxiety, and sometimes his dreams turned into nightmares, but each time, he had someone to comfort him, someone to remind him that he was safe. Smithfield Middle School eventually let out for summer break, and Timothy realized with mild astonishment that he looked forward to returning in the fall. He no longer dreaded the idea of being among classmates. Ella lived nearby, so they occasionally met up to ride bikes or grab ice cream. It was a life Timothy once thought impossible. Meanwhile, Ms. Dawson kept tabs on the legal outcomes for the Peters. They received significant prison sentences, and the possibility of them seeking parole anytime soon was slim. Each update brought Timothy an extra measure of relief. He still remembered the night they took him, the cold fear of the gun, the searing look of hatred in their eyes, but those memories were slowly losing their power over him. Mr. Jones's family came to visit once. Timothy was nervous, afraid of meeting new people who might judge him or look at him with pity. But they welcomed him with open arms, praising him for his courage, and told him he had a place in their family. Timothy found himself tentatively smiling, shyly thanking them. After they left, he curled up on the couch and whispered to Mr. Jones, "They seemed really nice." "That's new for me." Mr. Jones chuckled gently, patting Timothy's shoulder. "They're your family now," he said. "We all are." That notion, having a family, was something Timothy had never dared to believe in. He'd been shuffled between homes and group facilities, never certain if he'd stay in one place long enough to unpack. Now he had a father figure who genuinely cared, teachers who looked out for him, a friend he could rely on, and even an extended family that welcomed him. It felt like stepping into a bright new world after years in darkness. Summer stretched on with lazy days and the occasional planned outing. Timothy and Mr. Jones went to the movies, visited a local fair, and even took a brief trip to the beach, where Timothy marveled at the crashing wave. He would stand at the shore, feeling the cool water rush around his ankles, thinking about how life could change so drastically for the better. He wasn't naive enough to think all his trauma would vanish, but he embraced each happy memory as a treasure that could outweigh the pain. He had a home, a father figure, a circle of friends, and a life that stretched out before him with the promise of hope. Though he would always carry his scars, he also carried within him the courage to face each new day. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already and subscribe for more.